Welcome to Biology Minds. Today we're going to talk about the language of anatomy, or an introduction to anatomy and physiology. Chapter opens up talking about how humans are vertebrates, so it's important to know that evolutionarily we do share common ancestors with fish and amphibians, reptiles, birds. We all have this vertebrae made up of segmented vertebral column. Anatomy and physiology, it's all about structure and function. So when we talk about anatomy, we're talking about the structure. And when we talk about physiology, we're talking about the function. So typically when we're talking about anatomy, we're talking about the pieces or the parts of the body, and then the physiology is the way that it's working, the biochemistry, the genetics, how everything is functioning together. So structure versus function, anatomy and physiology, that's really what it comes down to. Like I said, anatomy is structure, and physiology is all about the function of the anatomy. So you can't have one without the other. You need the parts in order to have the functioning, and vice versa. There's different types of anatomy that we'll talk about. Gross anatomy, meaning gross as in large, all right, or big. You can talk about microscopic anatomy. Typically, we're going to talk about gross anatomy, the big structures, the big parts. You can have surface anatomy, talking about external features, the skin, how you look. Regional anatomy, the different body areas. Systemic anatomy, talking about organ systems, the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, lymphatic system. Those are systemic anatomy parts. Clinical anatomy is anything when we're talking about medicine or healthcare. So a lot of times we talk about clinical anatomy in order to see how anatomy relates to the real world and how you might see it if you're going to go into the field of medicine, if you want to become a doctor, a physical therapist, a nurse practitioner, a nurse, a physician's assistant, whatever it may be. That is going to be where anatomy and physiology is really important, the role that it plays in clinical anatomy. And then we don't talk about it too much, but there's developmental anatomy, and that's where we're talking about from conception, from birth, all the way up to death. Like I said, microscopic anatomy, we're going to talk about cytology, which is the study of cells, and then more importantly, we're going to talk about histology, the study of tissue. So when you get something removed from your body, they're going to send it to the lab, and the lab actually looks at it. The person that's looking at it is the histologist. They are looking at the tissues. Is the tissue normal? Is it abnormal? Is it cancerous? Is it benign? Is it malignant? That is all done by the histologist. So as important as cytology is, when we're talking about clinical anatomy, we're typically going to hear about the histologist and them looking at the histology of the tissue that they removed or when they did a biopsy. Physiology, different types of physiology, just like there's different types of anatomy. You have cellular physiology or cell physiology, the inner workings of the cell, just like we're going to talk about the inner workings of the entire body. Well, we can break it down to what's going on within the cell, just like we can talk about what's going on, what are the functions within one specific organ, or the organ systems, which would be systemic physiology, and then pathological physiology, which often is just called pathophysiology, is the effects of diseases on the physiology. All right, what effect does that disease have on the functioning of the anatomy? You want to understand the different levels. The most important one to understand is that once we hit this cellular level, so our body is going to be made up, and everything in the world is made up of molecules and atoms, and our body is going to be made up of molecules and atoms. But just because you're made up of molecules and atoms doesn't mean that you're a living thing. But once you are made up of cells, you are considered living. And then anything that is multicellular, typically those cells are going to come together and they're going to form tissues, and tissues are going to form organs. Organs form organ systems, such as, like I said, the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system, just like those are made up of organs such as the heart and the cardiovascular system, or the lymph nodes in the lymphatic system, or the lungs in the respiratory system. Those are our organs to our organ systems, and then the organ systems come together and they work together to create the organism. And this is just a visual representation. Atoms and molecules are going to make up larger molecules. So you have atoms are going to make up proteins. Proteins are going to make up maybe protein filaments, and then they're going to form these cells. And cells are going to work together to form tissues. Tissues are going to work work together to form organs. And then organs are going to work with other organs to form organ systems, and organ systems are going to work with other organ systems to form that organism. It's just a general overview. This course is all about going through each one of these organ systems, but just to get a general idea, you want to understand what the basic function and anatomy of each organ system is. So integumentary that's all about skin. With that, we include hair, sweat glands, nails. These are for protection typically. They also help in regulating body temperature and provide sensory information. Skeletal system, it's for support and protection. It is your bones. Also includes ligaments and cartilage, bone marrow. Muscular system consists of the muscles, not only the skeletal muscles that are going to move your limbs around, but also the muscles in your digestive tract and in your heart, which are different types of muscles. You have your nervous system made up of your brain. That's really going to be for responding to stimuli. That goes along with the endocrine system, which is made up of glands, where the nervous system is going to be more immediate response, and the endocrine system is going to be a delayed response, where these glands are secreting hormones, secreting chemicals, and they are having an effect on cells or tissues based on what chemical is being released from what gland. You have your cardiovascular system. Sometimes people call it a circulatory system, cardiac system. We're talking about the heart, the blood vessels, and the main idea is that you're going to take in oxygen and take in nutrients, and you're going to get rid of the carbon dioxide, and you're going to get rid of the waste that we don't need. Lymphatic system, in living environment or in biology, a lot of times they'll call it the immune system or immunity. Okay, that's the lymphatic system. Lymph nodes, lymph vessels, thymus, spleen, tonsils, these are all part of making sure that you defend against infection, disease, invaders, whatever it may be. Respiratory system, lungs, breathing. Digestive system, obviously for breaking down food in order to maintain the levels of nutrients that your cells need. Urinary system is going to excrete waste from your body, make sure that there's no buildup of nitrogenous waste. It's also going to help to regulate your pH in your body, made up of kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, urethra. And then you have the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system. And what this course is going to talk about a lot is homeostasis. You want to create a balance. So I always tell my students, yeah, things aren't always going to be perfect. You're not always going to have the perfect amount of nutrients. You're not always going to be the perfect temperature. All right, but you're going to stay within a range, and you want to maintain that stable internal environment. You don't want to go too far out of range. And I always talk about temperature is a great example. Yeah, you might feel really cold outside, it might be 20 degrees, but your body's not going to let you get too cold. Yeah, we're supposed to be 98.6 degrees. You might go down to 97, maybe 96 degrees. That's not going to be end of the world. But your body's never going to get down. Your internal temperature is never going to get down to 60 degrees. Just like if you're in the blazing sun in the desert, it's 125 degrees outside, and you are standing there, well, yeah, you're going to feel really hot, but your internal temperature is not going to get above 104 degrees. All right, we've all had fevers before when we get sick, and maybe your temperature was 102, 103. That's outside of your normal, which is 98.6, but it's not outside of necessarily the normal range that we can survive in. There's two different types of regulation. Typically, we talk a lot about extrinsic regulation, responses from the nervous system and the endocrine system. How are they reacting to the environment? How are they keeping us alive and maintaining that balance for us? But we'll also talk about intrinsic or auto-regulation, in which the cells and the tissues and the organs, they're kind of doing their own thing. They're just making sure that they are regulating themselves, and they are for example, cells are making sure that their water levels are at the proper amount. They're not getting too much water in them. They're not losing too much water. That's not being done by the brain or by the endocrine system. That's just being done by the cell. So you have the smaller level, which is autoregulation. They're kind of doing their own thing. And then you have what's going to make sure that there's no major changes is your extrinsic regulation, which is going to use the nervous system, the brain, and the endocrine system, the glands, to help regulate that. We always talk about receptors. They're going to receive messages or information from a stimulus, from the environment. You have the control center, which is going to process these signals and send out instructions. And then the effector is going to carry out the instructions. So we always talk about this idea of your thermostat in your house. So you have a thermostat in your house. Maybe you set it to a certain temperature. Well, when that temperature, when you leave that temperature that you want it to be, all right, in this example, it talks about it being your thermostats for your air conditioner. It goes for the same as if it was for your heater, but we'll talk about if it's your air conditioner. So you want it to be below, here we had it set to 22 degrees Celsius. Okay, I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but whatever it may be, you leave that range that you want to be in. You suddenly, it gets hotter than 22 degrees Celsius. Well, your thermometer within this thermostat is going to pick up on that, and it's going to send a message to the control center, and it's going to say, hey, this is not supposed to be this way. So it's going to send a message to your air conditioner, say, hey, kick on so that we can cool it down. Once it cools down, you're going to go back to homeostasis. You're going to be at the normal level that you want to be at. And then the thermometer is going to pick it up, and it's going to relay to the control center, hey, you can shut off. And this will go around and around and around, making sure that your body or your house stays at the proper temperature. And this is called a negative feedback loop. All right, sometimes it's just called negative feedback. Sometimes it's just called a feedback loop, but it's the idea that it's constantly going around. As things are getting too high, we're bringing them down. As things are getting too low, we're bringing them back up. It's this teetering idea that we want to stay within a range. All right, here is another example, or this is the real example, I should say, where your brain is now, we don't have this thermostat, right? We're not a house. We don't have an air conditioner. What we do have is we have a brain, and we have sensory cells on our skin, and it's going to sense temperature. It's going to relay that information to the hypothalamus in the brain, and the hypothalamus in the brain is going to say, hey, we're too hot right now. We got to start sweating. Or if we're too cold, hey, we got to start shivering. And that's going to go on until we get back to that temperature we want to. We get back to homeostasis. And once we get back to homeostasis, it's going to relay the message. The receptors are going to pick up on this. It's going to relay that message to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is going to say, hey, we can stop sweating, or if we're too, if we can stop shivering if we were too cold. And then we have positive feedback, which is a little different. It's not this constant teetering and monitoring where we're going to go back and forth, back and forth. It's more of an idea of pushing the envelope as we go. All right, we want to keep on accelerating whatever feedback we want. So it might be called a positive feedback loop or just positive feedback. But typically when you hear feedback loop, we're talking about negative feedback loops, but here we're talking about positive feedback. And positive feedback, a great example is blood clotting. So you get a cut, okay, there's going to be a break in your capillary, and your body's going to is going to pick up on that, and then platelets are going to be sent to that area, and platelets are going to send out chemicals, and the chemicals are going to say, hey, we need to keep getting clotting factor here, getting platelets here, and it's going to keep coming. And it never really sends a message back to stop this. It just keeps accelerating it. It's accelerating it. More chemicals, more clotting. We need more platelets so that we can form that scab. Eventually, when the scab forms, it's not really getting that message anymore saying, keep going, keep going, keep going, and it will taper off. But it never really quite sends a message back like it does with the negative feedback loop. Another example of this is when a woman is pregnant. She goes into labor. Oxytocin is a hormone or a chemical that's going to be released, and oxytocin is going to it's going to do two things actually. It's going to help the woman with her labor pains. So she's dealing with those contractions, trying to get the baby through the birth canal. It's going to help decrease her pain. But what it also does is it signals to the mammary glands to start producing breast milk. And once the breast milk is made, then eventually, and it's going to be a positive feedback loop where it's going to keep saying, hey, make milk, make milk, make milk. And eventually, that infant is going to start suckling. And once it starts suckling, then it's going to send more messages. Hey, keep going, keep going, keep going. Make milk, make milk, make milk. And eventually, what's going to happen is that, say a year down the line, the baby stops suckling. You have weaned the baby off of breast milk and they start eating whole foods and they don't need the milk anymore. Well, after a while, you never really quite say stop making milk, but it stops getting those signals to say keep making milk, keep making milk, keep making milk. And that positive feedback loop then ends then. But it's very different from a negative feedback loop where it's going to send that information back and say, hey, stop making milk. Another idea that we talk about, all right, we kind of use them interchangeably, but we have dynamic equilibrium. Okay, that's very similar to homeostasis, where we're talking about we want to maintain a state of equilibrium or of balance within the body. Failure to do so is considered a disease. Big part of this chapter, because it is constantly used throughout the course, is the language of anatomy. So when you go to the doctor, yeah, they might say things in layman's terms. They might break things down for you a little bit better than they would to another doctor they're talking to. But when they're going to document this information in your record, they're going to be very specific and use specific language. So instead of saying that it's on the top of you, all right, they might say that it's superior to the neck, superior to the ear. It's below the ankle. It's inferior to the ankle. All right, they're going to use this language to be more specific. So an anatomical position, if they say the patient was in anatomical position, they were just standing upright, hands at their sides with palms facing forward. Supine is if they were laying down, face up, flat on their back. Prone was laying down, face down on their belly. They have different quadrants that they might talk about. Abdominal pelvic quadrants, abdominal pelvic regions. And then there's different terms that they're going to also use for different body parts. So when we swab for DNA, if you ever have to do a DNA test, they're not going to say, hey, we need cheek cells, or we're going to do a cheek swab. They're going to call it a buccal swab. That is the anatomical term for that. So I'm not going to go through each one of these, but you do have to understand, if we're talking about thoracic, we're talking about the chest. Talking about cephalic, that's the head. Brachial is arm, so on and so forth. These are the quadrants. Notice that we talk about rights and lefts as it is on the patient. So this is our patient right here. This is his right upper quadrant. Okay, it's not how it is when I'm looking. If I'm looking at him, this is the right over here. But I'm not naming it based on that. I'm naming it based on where it is on the patient. So that is actually his left. So it is the left upper quadrant. And the doctor might say he has pain in his left upper quadrant. I made an incision in his right lower quadrant, whatever it may be. If they are a certain type of surgeon and they want to be more specific, they can also use these different regions right here, where you have the right hypochondriac region, left hypochondriac region, epigastric region, umbilical region, just to be more specific. And it's good to understand that where some of the organs are. We'll get more into that as we go. But keep in mind, this is the right side of the patient. This is the left side of the patient. Here we talk about lateral versus medial. All right, medial is through the midline, the middle. Lateral is towards the outside, away from the midline. You have distal. Distal is further from the point of attachment. Here we talk about the hip being the point of attachment. Here we have the shoulder being the point of attachment. And it's all relative. So I could say that something is medial to the elbow, but in reality something else will be lateral to the elbow. When we talk about proximal and distal, we're always talking about the point of attachment. So the ankle is proximal to the toes, where the toes are distal to the ankle. The toes are further away from the point of attachment than the ankle. We also have rights and lefts that we talked about. Cranial is another one that you're going to want to know. Cephalic, that's towards the head. Caudal is towards the tail. A lot of times they talk about these, veterinarians will talk about cephalic or caudal, because when you're talking about a dog, I can't just say top, because I don't know if you mean towards the head or if you mean where I'm going to pet on their back. So they're going to say, hey, it's dorsal, it's towards their back, or it's ventral, it's towards their stomach, or it's caudal towards their tail, cephalic towards their head. A lot of times with humans, we're going to use anterior, which is towards the front, posterior is towards the back, and we're going to talk about superior towards the top and inferior towards the bottom. You also have deep and superficial. Superficial is going to be towards the outside of the body. Your skin is superficial to the muscles, and your muscles are deep to the skin. It's further in than the skin is. Some of the planes that you're going to want to know about. So you're going to become a radiologist, a radiology technician. They need to know the different planes, and they're going to take pictures of these different planes, MRI, PET scan, CAT scan, X-rays. And if I were to cut you from front to back, right, that's going to be your frontal plane. If I cut you right down the middle, that's going to be your mid-sagittal, or even sometimes just called sagittal plane. And then if I cut you from top to bottom, into top and bottom, then that's your transverse plane. There's different body cavities that you want to know about. You have your ventral body cavity that's divided by a diaphragm, and you have the top portion, which is the thoracic cavity, and you have the bottom portion, which is the abdominal pelvic cavity. You have different membranes or different coverings within these cavities. You're going to have the parietal layer, which is going to line the entire cavity, which is going to line the specific organs. And it's always going to be like that. When you hear visceral, it's more towards the inside. It's closer to the organ, and parietal is going to be towards the outside, lining the entire cavity. You have the pleural cavities, referring to the cavities that contain the lungs. The mediastinum is going to be filled with blood vessels, your throat or your trachea, esophagus, and your thymus. Then you have the lower portion, which contains the pericardial cavity. Pericardial, cardia meaning heart. That's where the heart is going to be contained. So you have a representation of this. Top portion is the thoracic cavity. Bottom portion is the abdominal pelvic cavity, where you have this step from with the diaphragm. And diaphragm is separating the two. You have your peritoneal cavity, abdominal cavity, your pelvic cavity, and then in your thoracic cavity you have your pleural or your lung cavity, and your pericardial or your heart cavity. This just shows you a representation of how these cavities are going to help support and protect whatever the organ is. You have your peritoneal cavity, which is within the abdominal pelvic cavity. The parietal layer lines the internal body wall, where the visceral layer is going to line the actual or cover the actual organs. Abdominal cavity, pelvic cavity, and that's pretty much it. So there's a lot of language within this chapter, and you have to really wrap your mind around the different body directions and what we're going to be talking about this year. So that's it for Biology Minds. Have a good one.